Nora Ambrose was 32 years old the afternoon she stood in the back office of Iverson's Pawn and Jewelry in Traverse City, Michigan, and watched a man she'd never met before hold her grandmother's wedding ring up to a jeweler's loop, turning it slowly under a small white light, saying nothing for what felt like considerably longer than the actual 30 seconds it probably took. The ring had come to her 9 years earlier, the week she turned 23, passed down from her grandmother Vivian with a story attached to it that Nora had heard so many times she could recite it in her sleep. A modest half-carat diamond in a thin gold band, bought by Nora's grandfather in 1958 with money he'd saved from 3 summers working the cherry harvest in Leelanau County before he'd had the nerve to ask Vivian to marry him. It wasn't valuable in any way a jeweler would call valuable. It was valuable the way a story is valuable, which is a different thing entirely. And Nora understood, standing in that pawn shop, that she was about to trade one kind of value for another kind entirely, and that her husband would not see it that way at all. She had not told Grant she was doing this. She would tell him that evening after it was already done, because she had learned over 5 years of marriage that if she told him beforehand, there would be a conversation, and the conversation would not end with her walking out of that pawn shop with anything except the ring still on her finger, and a fresh, familiar sense that her judgment simply didn't count for as much as his did in the decisions that mattered. Leelanau County sat on a long peninsula jutting into Lake Michigan, cherry and apple country going back 4 generations for some of the families still farming there. The kind of place where a person could name every orchard along a given road by the family that ran it, or used to. Nora had grown up 2 counties over, the daughter of a man who'd worked as a county extension agent for 30 years, and she'd spent her childhood riding along on his farm visits the way some kids grew up around a family business, absorbing without meaning to a particular way of looking at soil and trees and the small visible signs that told you, if you knew to look, whether something was actually dying or just appeared to be. She'd met Grant at 26, working at the time as a part-time horticultural aide for the county extension office, a job that paid poorly but suited her. And Grant had finishing a degree in accounting, careful and methodical in a way that had, at first, felt steadying to Nora rather than confining. They married 2 years later, and for most of their marriage, the arrangement between them had worked well enough. Grant handling the finances with the same careful attention he brought to his actual job at a firm in Traverse City, Nora working the same extension job she'd always worked, both of them living within a budget Grant maintained down to categories and percentages in a spreadsheet Nora had genuine respect for, even as she sometimes chafed against how completely it governed every joint financial decision either of them made. The caution wasn't unearned. 4 years into the marriage, before either of them fully understood how bad it had gotten, Grant's brother talked them into co-signing a loan for a business venture that collapsed within 18 months, a decision Nora had agreed to at the time, over Grant's initial hesitation because she trusted Grant's brother more than the numbers deserved. It had taken them 2 years and most of their savings to climb back out from under that mistake, and Nora understood, even now, that the caution Grant carried into every subsequent financial decision they made together traced directly back to that specific failure, one she had pushed them toward and he had reluctantly agreed to, and one that cost them considerably more than money by the time it was finished. So when Nora found herself, the previous month, standing at the edge of a 14-acre cherry orchard on Center Road that a retiring farmer named Earl Van Tassel was trying to unload for whatever he could get, she already knew, with a certainty that unsettled her, that there was no version of asking Grant's permission that would end with him agreeing to spend joint money on it. The orchard looked to anyone driving past it on Center Road like exactly what Earl Van Tassel had been telling people it was for the better part of 2 years, a dying operation, not worth saving. Nearly every mature cherry tree along the northern rows carried heavy black swellings along its branches, some the size of a fist, some running a foot or more down a single limb, gnarled and dark against the gray winter bark, the kind of thing that looked to an untrained eye like exactly what a tree looks like when it's actively rotting from the inside out. Earl had lost most of his interest in fighting it 3 years earlier, after a bad ice storm damaged half his equipment, and his own health started declining hard enough that keeping up with the orchard's care became genuinely impossible for him alone. He'd stopped pruning it properly, stopped spraying it on schedule, and watched with the particular exhaustion of a man who'd farmed the same ground for 40 decades and simply had nothing left to fight it with, as the black knot spread through tree after tree until the whole northern block looked, by the time Nora first saw it, like something already lost. Nora had walked those rows on a Saturday afternoon in March, cold enough that her breath fogged in front of her, and had done what her father taught her to do on every farm visit she'd ever tagged along on as a kid. She'd looked closely before she believed what the whole orchard seems to be telling her at a glance. Black knot, she knew, caused by a fungus that infects cherry and plum trees specifically, produces exactly the kind of alarming black growths that made Earl's orchard look terminal to anyone who hadn't studied it closely. Dense, tar-like galls that ring themselves around a branch over successive years, girdling and eventually killing the wood beyond the infection site if left entirely unchecked. It has a well-earned reputation among home gardeners and even some commercial growers as a death sentence for an orchard. The kind of thing that spreads tree to tree on wind-carried spores every spring and eventually claims everything in its path. What most people don't know, and what Nora's father had drilled into her without either of them ever calling it a lesson, is that black knot is neither as fast nor as final as its appearance suggests. Properly managed through aggressive, well-timed sanitation pruning during the dormant winter months, cutting every visible knot at least 4 to 6 inches below the visible gall to remove fungal tissue the eye can't see, followed by prompt burning or removal of every cut branch so spores don't simply reinfect the same orchard from a discarded pile. An infected block of trees can be brought back from what looks, to an untrained observer, like a hopeless case. It takes 2, sometimes 3 full growing seasons of disciplined winter pruning to get ahead of it. It is slow, it is unglamorous, it requires exactly the kind of patient, repetitive labor most people, including Earl Van Tassel in his exhausted final years of farming, no longer have the strength or the will to give it. Nora had walked those rows for the better part of 2 hours that Saturday, cutting into a handful of the smaller galls with a pocket knife to check how far the infection actually ran into the healthy wood beneath it, and had come away from that visit with a conviction that felt, in her chest, like something closer to certainty than hope. The trees weren't dying, they were simply neglected, exactly the way a wound left untreated looks far worse than a wound properly cared for, even when the underlying injury is identical. There is a particular kind of loneliness in knowing something to be true and having nobody around you willing to believe it simply because you're the one saying it. Nora had felt that loneliness before, in smaller ways, across 5 years of a marriage where her instincts about land and growing things were treated, gently but consistently, as a hobby rather than a real form of expertise. Something charming and slightly impractical next to Grant's spreadsheets and Grant's numbers and Grant's carefully modeled version of what counted as a sound decision. She had brought up smaller versions of this exact frustration to him before, about a raised garden bed he thought was a waste of the water bill, about a compost system he considered an eyesore, small disagreements that had never risen to anything worth calling a real conflict, but that had, over years, taught her something quieter and more corrosive, that when it came to anything involving actual money, her read on a situation simply didn't carry the same weight his did, regardless of how much more she actually knew about the specific subject at hand. Earl Van Tassel wanted $11,000 for the 14 acres, land and dying trees included, a price that reflected, honestly, more what the bare land itself was worth for future development, since as far as Earl and most of the county were concerned, the orchard itself was worth nothing, a liability rather than an asset, something a buyer would need to bulldoze and replant from scratch if they wanted anything productive out of that ground again. Nora didn't have $11,000 that wasn't accounted for somewhere in Grant's spreadsheet. What she had, sitting in a small fireproof lockbox in the back of their bedroom closet, was her grandmother's ring, insured, at Grant's own insistence years earlier, for just over $9,000, a figure that had always struck Nora as almost beside the point, since she'd never once, in 9 years of owning it, thought of the ring as something with a dollar value attached to it at all. She sold it for $8,200, the pawn shop's offer after the jeweler finished his examination, a number that felt, standing at that counter, both enormous and strangely small at the same time, and she used it, along with the $1,100 remaining in a personal savings account she'd maintained separately from their joint accounts for as long as they'd been married, an account Grant knew existed and had never once, to his credit, tried to fold into his budgeting, to make Earl Van Tassel's asking price in full. She told Grant that evening, sitting across from him at their kitchen table after dinner, in the plainest language she could manage, because she had decided, somewhere between her walk through the orchard and the day she actually sold the ring, that if she was going to do something this large without his agreement, the very least she owed him was total honesty about it afterwards, delivered directly rather than discovered by accident. Grant did not raise his voice. That was, in some ways, the hardest part for Nora to sit with afterward, because she'd braced herself for anger, for shouting, for something loud enough that she could point to it later and say clearly that he had overreacted. What she got instead was a long silence, Grant setting down his fork very carefully, and then a question, delivered quietly, that stayed with her considerably longer than any raised voice would have. "Did you even consider for 1 second asking me first?" "I knew what you'd say," Nora told him, honestly, because there seemed no point now in pretending otherwise. "That's not the same as knowing I'd be wrong," Grant said. "You didn't skip asking me because you already knew the answer. You skipped asking me because you didn't think my answer should matter." Nora sat with that accusation for a long moment, because some part of it, however much it stung, wasn't entirely untrue. And she understood, watching Grant's face across their kitchen table, that whatever came next in this conversation, and in the weeks that would follow it, was not really going to be a fight about a ring, or an orchard, or $11,000. It was going to be a fight about 5 years of accumulated small moments in which Nora had quietly decided her own judgment needed a workaround rather than a fair hearing, and about what that decision, made privately and executed without him, revealed about how little she'd come to trust the actual partnership between them. Grant did not speak to her that night beyond what was strictly necessary. He didn't speak to her much the following morning either, or the morning after that, moving through their shared house with the particular careful distance of a person who has decided that engaging fully with a problem right now will only make it worse. A distance that Nora recognized, uncomfortably, as a mirror of exactly the same instinct that had led her to trade the ring without telling him in the first place. Neither one of them, it turned out, actually trusted the other's reaction enough to bring a hard thing to them directly and let it play out honestly in real time. By the end of that first week, Grant had moved his things into the guest bedroom, not announced with any particular drama, simply done quietly one evening while Nora was out at the orchard, and Nora came home to find his side of their closet empty and understood, standing in that doorway, exactly how much further this had traveled in her absence than she'd let herself imagine it would. It's worth pausing here on something worth understanding clearly, because it's easy, watching a marriage strain like this from the outside, to assume one person is simply right and the other is being difficult. Financial infidelity, the term researchers and marriage counselors actually use for exactly this kind of unilateral, undisclosed financial decision inside a marriage, doesn't require deception about an affair or a secret debt to do real damage. Studies on marital conflict consistently rank financial disagreements among the most corrosive sources of strain a couple can face, not primarily because of the dollar amounts involved, but because money decisions, more than almost anything else in a shared life, function as a direct signal of whether a partner considers you an equal decision-maker or someone to be managed around. A single large unilateral financial choice, even one that turns out materially to be a good decision, can do lasting damage to a relationship precisely because the harm isn't really about the money. It's about what the secrecy communicated regarding whose judgment in that marriage was allowed to count. Have you ever made a choice you were nearly certain was right, only to realize afterward that being right wasn't actually going to fix what the choice itself had cost you? That the rightness of the decision and the damage of how you'd made it were two entirely separate ledgers, and that no amount of vindication on the first one was guaranteed to settle the second.
Nora spent that first month while Grant slept down the hall and answered her in careful, minimal sentences over shared meals, neither of them fully wanting to be having, out at the orchard nearly every daylight hour she wasn't at her extension job, working her way through the northern block one row at a time, exactly the way her father had taught her decades earlier, without either of them calling it a lesson at the time. She cut galls at 4 to 6 inches below the visible infection, hauling the diseased wood to a burn pile at the edge of the property rather than leaving it stacked anywhere near the healthy trees. Working through the cold with her hands cracked and raw, despite the gloves, coming home most evenings smelling of wood smoke and cold sap, to a house that had, for the time being, stopped fully feeling like a shared project between two people.
By the second week of April, Nora had cut back nearly 2/3 of the northern block. The burn pile at the property's edge grown into something that smelled, on damp mornings, like the whole orchard was quietly confessing everything it had been hiding under Earl Van Tassel's exhausted final years of ownership. She'd bought, with the last of her separate savings, a proper sanitation solution to disinfect her pruning shears between cuts, a detail she'd learned from an old extension bulletin her father kept and that most casual growers never bothered with, since black knot spores could travel on an unclean blade from an infected branch to a healthy one just as easily as they traveled on spring wind, undoing weeks of careful work with a single careless cut if a person didn't take the extra 90 seconds between trees to wipe the blade clean. Grant, meanwhile, remained in the guest room through April and into May, the distance between them settling into something that had stopped being active anger and had become, instead, a kind of low, exhausting sadness that neither of them knew how to address directly. It was Nora's mother, visiting in early May and walking the orchard rows with her while Grant stayed back at the house, who finally said the thing Nora had been avoiding thinking about clearly for weeks. "You were right about the trees," her mother said, watching Nora work a cut on a stubborn old gall near shoulder height. "I believe that. But being right about the trees isn't the same thing as being right to hide it from him. You know that, don't you?" "I know," Nora said, and found saying it aloud for the first time that she meant it more fully than she had allowed herself to before. "I told myself I did it because he wouldn't have agreed. But I think some part of me also did it because agreeing would have meant actually asking, out loud, whether he trusted my judgment on something this big, and some part of me already suspected I knew the answer, and I didn't want to hear it said directly." "That's a different problem than the ring," her mother said. "That's a 5-year problem, not a one-afternoon problem. The orchard might fix itself, that other thing won't, not on its own." Nora carried that conversation with her through the rest of May, working the southern block now, healthier trees that needed lighter maintenance pruning rather than the aggressive sanitation cuts the northern rows had required. And it was sometime in that quieter stretch of work, cutting back water sprouts and thinning overcrowded limbs in trees that had never been badly infected to begin with, that she found the nerve to ask Grant directly for the conversation she'd been avoiding since the night she first told him about the ring. She found him on a Sunday evening in the kitchen, doing dishes with the particular focused attention of a man using a small task to avoid a larger one, and she asked if they could sit down together, not to talk about the orchard, but to talk about what the orchard decision had actually revealed. "I don't think this was really about you not trusting my judgment on trees," she told him, once they were sitting across from each other at the same table where this had all started 2 months earlier. "I think it was about me not trusting that you'd ever really believed my judgment counted for anything, on money, on decisions, on the things that actually matter in a marriage. And instead of telling you that directly, at some point over the last 5 years, I think I decided it was easier to just work around it than to have the actual fight about it." Grant was quiet for a long moment, turning a dish towel over in his hands the way Nora had once seen Earl Van Tassel turn his hat, a man working up to something he'd rather not say directly. "I think you're partly right," he said finally. "But I think you're also giving me too much credit for having thought about it as clearly as you just did. I didn't wake up one day and decide your judgment counted less than mine. I think I just never noticed across 5 years how many small decisions quietly went the way I wanted them to go because you kept letting them, and I never once asked myself why you kept letting them, or what it might have been costing you to keep doing that." He set the towel down. "That doesn't excuse what you did.
I still think you should have told me, even knowing what I'd probably say. But I don't think I get to stand here and act like I had nothing to do with building the reason you didn't." It wasn't a full repair, not that evening, and Nora understood, sitting across from him, that it wouldn't be finished in a single conversation, however honest. But it was, for the first time in nearly 2 months, an actual conversation rather than a careful avoidance of one, and Grant moved his things back into their bedroom the following weekend, not with any particular announcement, simply done quietly one afternoon while Nora was out at the orchard, the same way he'd moved them out 2 months earlier, except this time she came home to find his side of the closet full again instead of empty, and understood exactly what that meant without either of them needing to say it directly. The real test of Nora's work came the following spring, 14 months after she'd first walked those neglected rows with Earl Van Tassel's certainty that she was wasting her time still ringing in her ears. Black knot, properly managed, doesn't disappear in a single season, and Nora had spent that second winter doing the same disciplined work all over again. A second full pass through every tree in the orchard, catching new galls that had appeared from spores that had drifted in from a neighboring, still untreated property before she could fully contain her own trees, cutting them back the same careful 4 to 6 inches below the visible infection, disinfecting her blade between every single cut.
What changed by that second spring was the volume of new infection compared to the first year, dropping so noticeably that even a casual observer driving past on Center Road could see the difference in the canopy's overall health. Fewer black scars against the bark, more even growth along branches that had spent years fighting an infection nobody had been properly treating. The trees bloomed that April in a way Earl Van Tassel himself hadn't seen them bloom in the better part of a decade. Dense white blossom covering rows that had, 2 springs earlier, looked like something already given up for dead. The cherry harvest that July, Nora's second full season on the property, produced close to 11,000 pounds of tart cherries off 14 acres that had, by any reasonable measure 18 months earlier, been considered a total loss, worth nothing beyond whatever the bare land itself might someday fetch from a developer. She sold most of it through a regional processor in Traverse City who paid a modest but real price per pound for tart cherries destined for pie filling and juice concentrate. And after costs, the harvest cleared just over $9,000 in its very first productive year, a number that would only grow, she understood from the same extension research that had guided her through the pruning itself, as the trees continued recovering their full vigor over the following several seasons. She stood at the edge of the orchard the evening the last of that first real harvest was picked and hauled off to the processor, Grant beside her, having come out to help load crates that week the way he'd started doing more and more often as the tree's recovery became impossible to argue with. And she thought about the particular weight of a ring leaving her hand across a pawn shop counter 14 months earlier, a moment she'd been so certain of and so afraid of at the same time, and understood, standing in that orchard now full of fruit instead of black scarred wood, that the vindication she felt looking at those trees wasn't really the point, or wasn't the whole point anyway. The point was standing beside a husband who had, over the previous year, actually done the harder work of asking himself honest questions about a marriage neither of them had been managing quite as well as either of them wanted to believe. Work that no amount of successful cherry harvest could have done on its own, however satisfying it felt to have been right about the trees. Earl Van Tassel came by again that August, slower on his bad hip than he'd been the previous spring, and stood at the edge of the orchard looking at rows heavy with fruit that had, 2 years earlier, looked like exactly the kind of thing a man spends his final farming years quietly grieving rather than fighting. "I owe you an apology, I think," he said, watching a row of trees Nora had personally saved from what he'd been certain 3 seasons into his own failed fight was an unstoppable loss. "I told you that you were wasting your time out here. You weren't wrong that it was hard, you just gave up 1 season too early. It happens to a lot of people. The trees don't care whether the person fighting for them believes it's working yet. They just need someone who keeps showing up either way." Earl nodded slowly, looking out over the recovered rows for a long moment before he spoke again. "Your grandmother's ring bought this place, didn't it? I heard about that around town." "It did," Nora said. "Was it worth it?"
Nora considered the question honestly before she answered it, thinking not just about the 14 acres now heavy with fruit, or the $8,200 a pawn shop had once handed her across a counter, but about 2 months of a marriage that had nearly come apart over exactly how she'd made this decision, and the year of harder, quieter work that had followed it, work that had nothing to do with cherry trees at all. She kept the replacement simple. A plain gold band Grant gave her the following spring on the 2nd anniversary of the harvest rather than any traditional occasion, with no diamond at all this time, a choice Nora had made deliberately and explained to him without him needing to ask why.
"I don't need it to be worth anything to anyone else," she told him, turning the new band on her finger the way she'd once watched a pawn shop jeweler turn her grandmother's ring under a loop light, checking for a value neither of them had ever really understood the same way. "I just need it to mean we finally learned how to actually ask each other the hard questions, instead of finding quieter ways around them."